So we're going to be starting talking about solving equations and what that looks like. So there's a few things that we need to go over before we dive into these multi-step equations and reviewing just the 1 and 2 step equations. So first off, we need to talk about inverse operations. So we've already kind of discussed the inverse property, and we want to talk about what does the word inverse really mean. The simplest definition for inverse is an opposite or the reverse of something. So when we talk about operations, of course we're talking about addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. That's from that original vocabulary that we started with for the year. And so an inverse operation means using opposite or reverse operations. So the opposite of addition we know is subtraction. We also know that the opposite of division is going to be multiplication. And then a couple that we don't really talk about because, you know, they're still in examples of multiplication and division, but it's important to make sure that we talk about these because sometimes we'll come across them and need to know how to work with them in an equation, and that's an exponent. Okay, so a number or a variable squared, and the opposite of that is going to be the square root. And vice versa. So keep that in mind. It does work in the opposite direction. That's why the arrows here have, the arrows here have a head on each end, because we're talking about it can go either direction. And so the important thing to remember about inverse operations is this: inverse or opposite operations are used to undo or reverse an operation when solving equations. So we're taking an operation that's being done to something and we're undoing it or reversing it using an opposite operation. And we'll kind of talk more about those examples as we go further, but part of what that means in being able to do that is understanding your properties of equality. So if you look at the back, and we'll talk more about properties of equality in a different example video, but properties of equality, these are the 4 properties of equality. You have the addition property, where if you add the same amount to each side of the equation to keep it balanced. So if I add something to the left side, I also have to add to the right side. Same thing with subtraction. If I subtract something from one side, I have to subtract it from the other. Same with multiplication and division. If I multiply something by one side of the equation, I have to multiply it by the other to keep it balanced. And if I divide one side by something, I have to also divide the other side of that same amount to keep it balanced. So those properties of equality are what we're using as we're solving equations in inverse operations. So we're going to go ahead and just talk through this here at the bottom just to kind of show you that example and how it all works together. So here we have 2 is being multiplied by x, and that's equal to 10. And so what we want to do is get the x by itself so that we can find out what the value of that x is. So because 2 is being multiplied by x, the inverse of that, or the opposite operation of multiplication, is going to be division. So we're going to divide this side by 2. Well, we want to keep our equation balanced, so if I divide this side, I also have to divide the right side as well. And that's going to be our division property of equality. So you see kind of how these work hand in hand with solving equations, and these are just basic 1-step equations that we'll practice some more here in a little bit, but this is kind of the setup for that. And so what happens here now is that 2 divided by 2 becomes 1, so 1x, and 10 divided by 2 becomes 5. And so now we found that solution by undoing what was being done. So again, I want to undo here number 2 what's being done to this variable. Well, right now I'm adding a -5 to that variable, and so what I want to do is I want to do the inverse of that. Okay, And before I do the inverse, what I'm actually going to do is switch this around so that it's more common. So the commutative property tells me that I can switch the order of that, and I can make it x plus a negative 5, or written as x minus 5. But that's the same thing. And so now I see that I'm subtracting 5 from that x. So what I want to do to undo that is add. So I'm going to add 5. And because I add 5 on the right side, I also have to add 5 on the left side. So that's going to make this the addition property of equality. Okay. So here I have a negative 5 and I add 5 and I get 0. So that's that inverse operation that we've been talking about, or the inverse property. And then when I add the 5 over here, I get 17. So then that's how I find out that my value of x is 17. Okay. Another example, same situation here. Now we have x plus 7 is equal to 9. And if you wanted to rewrite it, we know that we could as x plus 7 because the commutative property tells us we can switch that around. And so I'm adding again. This is the is what I'm doing. So the inverse of that, or the opposite to get rid of that addition, is going to be subtraction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 7 to get rid of it, or to move it, okay, to the other side. So I'm going to subtract it over here. So we're using that subtraction property of equality. So when I subtract over here, I get 0, and I'm left with x, and over here I subtract and I get 2. So I find out that my value of x is 2. And then one final example, here I have x divided by 3, so the opposite of division is going to be multiplication. So I'm going to multiply by 3, and because I did it to the left side, I have to do it to the right side, so that's going to be the multiplication property of equality. So again, I'm going to multiply by 3. That gives me 1x over here on the left, and over here I end up with a negative 36. And so that's going to be my value of x. So when we go to solve equations, keep in mind we're using inverse operations and the properties of equality to justify what we're doing, and how we're trying to get that variable by itself and find out what the value of that variable is. And so we'll do some more additional practice with properties of equality and also some one-step equations before we move into two-step and multi-step equations. So hopefully this will kind of just put all the pieces together for you.